Hope you all are having a great day today. So just as a reminder today, we'll be hearing two presentations on Chapter 3, which is, of course, a single entity. So we certainly look forward to that. Do want to kind of make a couple quick announcements, though, before we jump into the presentations. I'll be quick. I don't want to encroach on anyone's time. But make sure you submit your exam corrections by today at midnight. So make sure you submit them by 11:59 p.m. I will not be accepting those late. So hopefully you get done. If you only get done with, say, some percentage of them, you'll still get partial credit. Partial credit beats no credit. So I'd certainly recommend doing that. Apart from that, since, last week the discussion didn't really go exactly according to plan, I decided as a big market person, I'm really big into, the pricing according to what market demand and supply. So what I determined to do was to give 5 points for participation today, with some caveats. So I believe we're going to have one group in person, and I believe we're also going to have one group via Teams. So what I'm going to do to kind of address that is, if you're in person, if you participate in the first presentation here we're about to have with Amy and Tate, you'll get 5 points on your exam 2. And if you're on Teams and you unmute your microphone and speak during the second presentation, you'll get 5 points on exam 2. But the key is that you have to unmute your mic and speak to earn those points. So I do want to encourage a good discussion. I don't want it to be a discussion between me and the groups. I'm not willing to, but I'd rather it be a good class discussion. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Amy and Tate, and they're going to go ahead and start us off.
So Chapter 3 overall talks about entities, attributes, identifiers. It also talks about the SQL, but we don't know how to work that. So today we're going to go over briefly about entities, attributes, identifiers, and the bank ERD that we had as an example from the previous week.
Can I fix that before we keep going? Our slides and we don't know how that happened.
Here. Sorry, guys, it'll be just a minute here. Just go ahead and make a copy of it. Should be able to download it. All right, can everyone see that okay? Sorry about that little delay.
So starting with entities, entity is something that is in the environment. An entity has attributes also, which describe it, and entities also have identifiers, which uniquely distinguishes an instance from an entity. Every entity must have a unique identifier. And as you can see on the PowerPoint, entity is in quotes. That's where the entity name goes. And an entity is also represented by a rectangle. Attribute is a discrete element of data. It is not usually broken down into smaller components. Attributes identify what they want to store inside the entity. And every attribute must be unique and meaningful to that entity. Every name must be unique. It can't match another name from another entity. And identifiers are also just a singular collection of attributes, and they're denoted by an asterisk, as noted in the PowerPoint. And right here we have from the previous weeks the bank ERD example that we would like to show. As you can see, account, customer account, and transaction are all the entities in this ERD with everything underneath each entity name as their attributes.
So using the notes that were provided in Chapter 3, we made up an imaginary business based on the provided ERD model called the Spanx Bank. So on the next slide. So in this ERD model, there are 4 entities that model the bank firm. The word in blue are the blue headers are the entities like Tate has stated before. The words with PK labeled to the left are its primary keys, and the words labeled FK are the foreign keys. The customer entity has the customer's information, and it has a relationship of one-to-many with the customer account entity. The customer account entity has a one-to-one relationship with the customer entity and a one-to-one relationship with the account entity. And the account entity has a one-to-many relationship with the customer account and a one-to-many relationship with the transaction. And finally, the transaction entity has a one-to-one relationship with the account. Here we have the financial analysis for our made-up bank firm. First, we have efficiency. Before implementing the ERD model into our system, we had a lower amount of transactions per day. After implementing the ERD model, our transactions increased from 24 to 50 transactions per day. Next is the transaction time. The transaction times went from being roughly 20 minutes per transaction to 10 minutes per transaction, cutting the time down by half and making it so much more efficient. In terms of revenue, it increased from $12 million to $20 million per revenue in revenue per quarter. And finally, it went from 38,000 to 63,000 customers per quarter for our bank firm.
So starting with the discussions, what would be a pro of using an ERD in a bank from a technological perspective?
Yes, Sam?
It would also keep like all the data and information more organized, as an ERD is a clear description of how the data entries relate to each other and the minimum and maximum cardinalities between each entity. What is question 3? A con from a technological perspective of an ERD.
Yeah.
It's just like it would be like if the ERD, if our cardinality was wrong, it could throw off the whole like flow of information, or if a name, if one of the attributes in the entity is the same as another attribute in a different entity, it would throw it all off. What is a pro from a financial perspective? In the end, it probably would be, but it would allow the bank to have a more streamlined process of the transactions that they have. Let's just say, like, using ERD, you would have you'd be using technology to handle all those transactions and the data and information. But before, like banks back then, everything was done by paper. so it could be lost. So when it's done by computer, more transactions can be processed in a shorter amount of time versus by paper or by person. What would be a con of using an ARD from a financial perspective? You would also probably if a bank switched from paper to a database and using ERD, you might have to bring in somebody to show them how to use it because they probably wouldn't know how to read the data information that's on the computer. And then the transition time would probably slow things down in sense of how many transactions because you're having to train people on how to use the new system.
Yeah, if I can jump in here. So I kind of made a mistake. You guys are the only ones presenting today. I look at the schedule. Actually, the problem is I didn't look at the schedule. But, so if you're joining with teams, I'll just make sure to give you credit. So certainly keep that in mind. But you can certainly feel free to jump in at any time. But then beyond that, I think that with the ERD, it really depends upon the scale. So there's going to be a pretty large fixed cost. To sit down, to plan out a database, to go through each step of, getting your requirements, getting the technology to do it, you're going to have a very large fixed cost. So if you're a very large firm, you're certainly going to, that's a good thing because, the marginal cost is far lower with using, data models and using databases ultimately. But if you're a smaller firm, it could be a case where it doesn't make sense to actually do simply because you're having such a large fixed cost. The marginal cost is going to be lower, but you still have that fixed cost. So when you add the two together and divide by the amount, your fixed cost that you're accounting for, if you have, say, 5,000 transactions, may not make sense. So I think that it's not necessarily a con for every type of, or every situation, but it's certainly something to consider.
Basically, all these are the same question. We're asking, what would be a pro from a people's perspective of using ERD in a bank or anywhere else?
Being able to keep track of everyone much more easy.
And also, using an ERD in any sense in a database, not just for a bank, it's the standard in the the business world on how data is organized. So if you had somebody come in from somewhere else that worked there, they would know how to read, or essentially know how to read most of the data that you have for your business, for your bank.
I think another benefit would be, if you're a customer, you're going to like that they can complete transactions at a quicker time. I don't know about anyone else, but I certainly don't like to spend all day in line at a bank. So I think that's a very large benefit. And then beyond that, it's very possible that that's going to reduce the cost of goods sold. If you're talking about a large firm, they can make it more efficient to do transactions. So that can allow them to either increase their profitability, which makes it less likely they'll fail long term, or the flip side is that they could maybe provide additional services that they couldn't otherwise provide. Maybe they can reduce their banking fees, something like that. Certainly a possibility, maybe they could increase the interest they're paying on certain types of accounts. Lots of different things. Pretty much anything that they do with the reduction in cost of goods sold is going to, it's going to positively impact the customer. Like I said, even with the increased profitability, they're less likely to fail. Therefore, it's better to bank with a bank because you certainly don't want to put, $100,000 in a bank that's likely to fail, even with FDIC insurance and all that. It's still not convenient to not have access to your money for that amount of time.
Let's just say, like, Regions Bank, if you mobile deposit a check, you're talking about waiting for a transaction, that's there the next day. If they didn't have the database system built for that, that would be able to read the account number on your check or anything to put it in there. You have to wait for a person to actually do that. And the scale of Regions Bank isn't telling how long that actually takes. Then the last question, on of using an ERD from a people's perspective. Huh? So in this sense, people, like if you're bringing in somebody new, every ERD is a little different, and all of them are a little different from each other. Like when we were looking up examples of ERD, all of them look different. Like some of them don't have, their entities aren't in rectangles. Some of them are like the attributes aren't even in the same box. So some people may have trouble reading the ERD in the database and may not be able to understand the symbols and validate the information if it's correct or not.
I guess I'll jump in here to keep the discussion kind of going. So, when you're looking at ERD, when you're talking about the employees using it, like Sam said, it's going to increase the learning curve. I think beyond that, when we have all these technological systems, there can be, in a lot of cases, we add a system that makes sense to the developers, makes sense to the engineers, but maybe it doesn't make sense to the people. So I'm not saying it's a con of every system, but it's an additional consideration that takes time and money to address to make it to where your system that you're implementing doesn't make it more burdensome for the employees to use, because you don't want to increase frustration. If you increase frustration among employees, assuming you have a labor market present, they're going to be more likely to leave your firm, and then you're faced with various costs associated with employee turnover, such as having to retrain employees, having to, spend time posting job positions, hiring people. All that takes time, all that takes money. So, it's certainly beneficial to make a work environment that avoids having stuff that would make the employees, feel overburdened. So, ideally, if you're doing an ERD properly and you're doing a database system properly, it takes the burden off of employees. It makes them more productive. We think back to that productivity paradox that we talked about. That's one of the arguments in support of technology inside of firms, is that it makes the employees more productive. Of course, the drawback is that a lot of studies don't find that. Now, you could argue that the studies that don't find that have lots of problems, and we'll certainly, I would say we'll get into that later, but it's not really covered inside the class. But just kind of keeping in mind, in general, we should be developing systems that make it easier for people to work and make it more pleasant, basically.
I know where my mom used to work. They were redoing one of the part of their systems, like she worked in insurance, so they did everything with the computer. And they were redoing one part of their system, and they had some of their employees come in with the engineers to actually talk about, because I think what they did, they like almost had it built, but then they brought them in to see like what part of this is confusing. And so, they got the workers' input, then they changed what parts they said were confusing for them.
Yeah, there's really no right system to build for an organization, but there's an infinite amount of incorrect systems to build. So I think just making sure that it meets the user's requirements, making sure that it's a functional system, it doesn't have a lot of time that it takes to do things. That's one thing that upsets me about Canvas. When I'm teaching a lecture section, it's a 5 or 10 minute process for grades to be updated. In my opinion, it should be an instantaneous process. I should be able to upload a spreadsheet and they're instantly updated. But I could go on and on about Canvas. I better stop while I'm still ahead. But certainly just having systems that meet requirements, they do them well, they make the job of the user easier instead of more difficult. That's what this is all about.
I guess, you could also, switching to, an ERD or database let's just like when Mississippi State switched to Canvas, it was a learning curve. for the instructors, the students, everybody coming from Blackboard. I know some teachers still struggle with it today, but
Any other people want to add anything? All right, well, great job, guys.
just log out of this one.
I just looked at it wrong. There's only
Just do it,
one
might as well.
presentation today. I thought there were two. Sorry.
Thank you.
All right, so great job. Like I say, if you attended the presentation today, I'll just give you 5 points on exam 2. Like I said, I thought there was a second one, but turns out I thought wrong. So, certainly thanks for attending today. Beyond that, let me know if there's any questions about anything that I can answer. I think that they did a great job on the financial analysis of this, making up a firm, going through some numbers. I think they did an excellent job on that. So I'd certainly recommend doing something similar. There's, always room to kind of do things in a creative fashion. So certainly, apart from that, you all certainly are free to go. I hope you all have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.